You're listening to The Voice of Russia. This is our weekly link-up with our bureaus in Washington, D.C., Moscow and here in London. My name is Brendan Cole. By George, the bookmakers were right. George was the rock-solid favourite, and indeed, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge's first baby has been named George Alexander Louis. He's the third in line for the throne and was shown to the public for the first time swaddled in a blanket. Blanket media coverage has also abounded as viewers of rolling news channels were treated to days of very little developments and correspondents and TV news presenters valiantly trying to make something out of very little. But it's undoubtedly a good news story. It's certainly added something to this feel-good summer, which has so far seen significant British sporting success. But was this media frenzy warranted? Was it a blow for journalism and social media? And has the media here in the UK and globally reflected the interest in the story that people actually feel more broadly? What about how the media reports other stories, casts people as heroes? Where does journalism sit in all of this? Well, to discuss this, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio with Richard James. He's the Deputy Head of Content at Metro newspaper. That's a daily paper which is the UK's fourth largest. Also here in the studio is Richard Fitzwilliams. He's a royal commentator and former editor of the International Who's Who. We will be joined in a few moments with our guests in Moscow and in Washington. Well, I mean, it was media overkill, don't you think, Richard Fitzwilliams? I mean, we were hardly on the edge of our seats, although people were waiting for a long time. I almost felt sorry for those poor old news anchors waiting and reporting on nothing.
Well, I think we have to realise that the inevitability of what you call overkill. You're talking about a story dealing with the British royal family. Now, that is inevitably going to mean that there's going to be absolutely phenomenal coverage. I mean, there's no doubt that there's an extraordinary interest in anything to do with the British royals. And that being the case, one naturally would find, as we saw with the royal wedding, as we saw with the Diamond Jubilee, as we also saw very briefly with the 60th anniversary of the coronation, naturally there is an obsessive interest. What was extraordinary is this wasn't just interest, it was a global frenzy. It's one thing to describe reporters in front of a hospital when they don't know when there is going to be an announcement, they don't know when it's going to be a report of what, was a boy or a girl, or indeed whether there's going to be an appearance. In front of that hospital was something like 200 to 300 reporters hungry for every single shot that they could get, and they had to be there. Why did they have to be there? Well, in 1982, when Diana went into hospital 10 days early, the same St Mary's Paddington, when she had William, there was only a skeletal presence, and this has been a media wait of weeks, and there have been reports, and the idea is now that this is a story that has rather been overplayed. In fact, you look at the British royal family, there are 44 royal families throughout the world, and the Queen's head of state of 16 realms. There is absolute fascination. Look at the way it was covered by the Americans. Look at the way the Canadians and Australians and New Zealanders have been interested in the story. It was a complete international interest, and also the historical fact that for the first time in 120 years, and briefly in the same Lindo wing of the hospital when the Prince of Wales visited and Prince William was there, we had three in succession to the throne, alive, obviously. This hasn't happened since 1894, when Edward VIII was born. So really this was historic, it was dramatic, it was a story that people did want to hear about, and obviously in any family, when you have a baby that's born to a happy home, obviously that is something that's joyous. But in this case, the world's most high-profile royal family, it was no surprise to me that we got the coverage we did.
Well, Richard James, I mean, didn't it make you feel a little bit uneasy having a battery of journalists camped outside a hospital? The poor woman is trying to give birth. What if something had gone wrong? What if the labour had lasted several days?
Yeah, that's true. There was that problem. I think also that there was no due date. Well, there was speculation. No one really knew exactly when it was. So the press turned up 2 weeks before in some cases. So they were camped out there for days because it was too large a story for anyone to miss. I mean, it's easy to say, you know, they deserved a bit of privacy, but that was never going to happen. The photographer who actually caught her going into the hospital when she went into labour decided that he claimed he morally wasn't going to take the picture before he took the image of the car. I mean, whether we believe him, I'm not sure. He may have completely missed the picture. I don't know. But as Richard says, it was such a ginormous story that I would be surprised if there'd been any fewer journalists there. Do you know what I mean? It's such a global, massive.
But do you not think some of this was manufactured in the sense that, I mean, people talked about how, throngs of people outside the palace, for instance, and actually there was one, a Republican voice, Joan Smith, an inveterate Republican. She made the point that actually there was far more journalists than there were actually people queuing outside. So I'm just wondering, really, the people in the UK were sort of had this forced down their throats in a way. I mean, of course, this is a huge story. It's the summer. There's no denying that. But really, I mean, there's a significant proportion of the population that would not feel that it would warrant wall-to-wall coverage in the way that it got.
Well, yeah, you say that, but at the same time, figures have been released this week that show the BBC News website had its largest ever day, the Mail Online had its largest ever day. So if people watching the 24-hour rolling coverage may have, they've since come out and said it's too much. Kay Burley running around outside the hospital for 36 hours is too much. But then the figures back it up. The people were checking online. They were looking for the pictures.
They were checking online, though, weren't they? I mean, that's rather than watching it on television. I mean, the figures, as you say, they speak for themselves. I think the Daily Mail had its record level of users, 10 million unique users over the course of this. I mean, that's phenomenal figures. I mean, in terms of your publication, I mean, how did you cover the story?
Well, obviously didn't give it the 24-hour rolling news coverage that, say, Sky News or the BBC would, but you couldn't deny that it was the biggest story. I mean, we saw an uplift in traffic. I think almost all news websites across the UK saw uplift in traffic over these last couple of days. So we gave it, huge coverage. And when it was announced that she had given birth, it was just full takeover of the homepage, because it was the story that everyone was reading. It's the story that everyone wanted updates on. So, you could say, yes, we should have, once she went in and there was no news, leave it. But if people are coming back and back and back for more updates, then that's what you'll give them.
But perhaps those kinds of rolling blogs and things like that and updates, that kind of story is more suited to them rather than rolling news channels, because at the end of the day, all you're going to do is report on what the palace tells you.
Well, yes, there's
and
true.
The palace didn't tell us till 4 hours after the event.
Mind you, it's also what you see, the tweet that told us about the way the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge had slid into a side door at the hospital.
Very modern.
I mean,
yes.
Very modern, no, but I mean, they are trying to make the baby's life, the young prince's life, as modern and as contemporary as is feasible and as possible in the Royal Goldfish Bowl. There's no doubt about that. But I mean, readers of papers and those, I'm looking at the Twitter, vast, as you'd expect, amount of activity on Twitter, and the rolling news channels where there's been this coverage and there's been the complaints. You would expect a story of this sort, unusual though it is. It had elements of drama. For goodness sake, I mean, the fountains in Trafalgar Square, the London Eye, several of the main monuments in London turned blue. Heavens, also, in front of the palace, where I was watching rolling news, you might have veteran Republicans seeing one thing. In my opinion, veteran Republicans seem to see what they want to see. But I saw revellers. I saw a tremendous amount of enthusiasm. And up and down the country, people would have certainly expected to be informed of every aspect of the story. It's the heir to the throne.
But in terms of pictorially, there wasn't much to look at apart from a golden easel and a piece of paper plastered on it. Until we saw the baby, that was all that we could see.
Well, actually, as you will recall, the intention was that an official would go from the hospital with a police escort and place the news on the easel, and that was how he would be told, as we were in 1982 when William was born. As you know, fearful that social media, Twitter in particular, might supersede this, because there were 10 minutes before the person would leave the hospital and reach the palace, a press release was issued which rather slightly marred the theatre of it, so that we knew all the details before that easel was reached. But there is, as I say, it was an aspect of drama that gripped certainly me, of course, as a royal watcher. Of course it would. But people are fascinated by the royal family. We know this and we've seen this in all the big royal events. And there's no question at all, if you look at the popularity, I mean, this Evening Standard poll, Ipsos Mori poll just a week ago, 79% wanted the royals and 17% wanted a republic. There's no doubt that aspect of it, but also you've got this extraordinary monarch of 87 and the Duke at 92, able to do what they are doing in the way they are. It is amazing.
Isn't there some kind of manipulation, Richard James, though? I mean, this does very much suit the royal family in terms of the Republican movement is dead and buried at the moment. I mean, in the overseas territories which over which the Queen is head of state, it's a bit more divided. It's a bit more 50-50. But certainly here, you heard that figure, 17% of people, only the vast majority of people want the royal family to stay. So this is a great public relations coup for them.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's a bit cynical, I'd say. I think general mood, as I wrote earlier today, is just one of relief. I mean, I think maybe it has cynical to suggest it was a PR coup. I think everyone's just...
the birth of but the way the machinery of the palace handled this. I mean, they kept people on tenterhooks, and we had 4 hours before the announcement of the birth. I mean, this really fits into the royal family is alive and well and more popular than ever.
Yeah, indeed. Well, the BBC issued a statement this week defending their coverage because they were accused of bias by some listeners and readers who claimed that it was too in favour of the British monarchy. But as we heard, the figures speak for themselves. So I don't really think, you can't. There's nothing really more to say. I mean, the people are overwhelmingly in favour of them, and they're overwhelmingly interested in them.
May I make one point, by the way? May I pick you up just on that comment you made? I'm not going to let you get away with the comment you made about it being vaguely 50-50 in the Commonwealth, in the 15 other realms. If you look at Australia, we've actually seen something quite extraordinary. It's perfectly true the monarchists won the 1999 referendum, and by a small majority it was assumed that Australia would proceed to a republic relatively gradually, perhaps not in the Queen's lifetime, but quite soon. After the royal wedding, polls have swung completely in the last direction. The Galaxy poll in January has 33% for a republic. So there's a change. And in Canada, they brought back royal for the Navy and the Air Force. They brought back knighthoods and damehoods in New Zealand. And they've had referendums in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Tuvalu to keep the monarch, as well as no Republican referendum in Jamaica, which was going to have one. So I think a very, very good time for the monarchy.
Indeed, the Annus Horribilis seems a lifetime ago, but I'd get the view from the United States from our guest in Washington, D.C., Professor Amos Gelb. He's Director of Videography and Broadcast at the Medill Washington program. He's also an Emmy Award-winning documentary maker. Professor Amos, I mean, in the United States, as we heard just before, this was huge news, wasn't it? I mean, what's the appeal of the royal family and this royal baby in the US and how the media is covering it?
Well, it's history. I mean, as your illustrious guests there have pointed out, there is this romance, this love. How can you not want this? But I think there's a sort of bigger issue. It actually reminded me, and the reference to the past, when William was born, there were fewer there. You go back to O.J. Simpson. I was at CNN when O.J. Simpson happened. And the network tried to go away from O.J. Simpson. Everybody said, too much. And every time they went away, the audience disappeared. So they came back to it. And that's been the mode since. And the problem now is that the drive for news here on the rolling networks, on the websites, on the blogs, is that there always has to be that next story. What goes on? Jodi Arias, Trayvon Martin, the next thing. I raised a question a couple of days ago to a bunch of my journalism students right now, and I said, what's the big deal about Oklahoma City? And nobody could remember that barely 2 months ago, the place was leveled. A small town was destroyed, virtually destroyed. 24 people died. The same place that a tornado had obliterated the same place 10 years ago, they couldn't remember. It's that moving on. And this is the story, this need to feed the beast. So when you add the need to feed the beast with the need to, with the fascination with the royals, whether they wanted to or not, they needed to cover it. They've created this monster, and it was the coming together. It was the perfect storm. Royals, slow news.
Are you suggesting that we've got
nothing
short
happening.
memories, though? You say that within a couple of months, people have forgotten about Oklahoma. Are you saying that the way the media covers these kinds of stories, they're moving on to the next thing, and we'll forget all about this royal baby, perhaps?
Well, we'll forget about this frenzy. There'll be something else. This frenzy will fade. You can go back to big one, the tsunami that devastated Japan. When I say it now, everybody goes, "Oh yeah, that was a big thing," but that's already gone. That was monumental. We've forgotten about the Arab Spring, right? That was just 2 years ago. Now we're into Arab Spring 3.0. So it's the interest keeps going on. But come back to that point, the royals, and it's only the British royal family. It's no other royals, none of the other 43 families that are out there, as was pointed out. There is a special place, and for all that Americans may strut and pomp, have our own sense of importance and the swag of Americans, let's face it, everybody loves a king and a queen and a prince and his beautiful princess and the romance and a perfect wedding. Oh, it's a great story, and it's a great visual. Two beautiful-looking young people.
Even for a country like the United States, which threw off the yoke of the British.
Yeah, well, you know what? Americans at heart have this romantic image, wish they were. The biggest thing, the thing that blew my mind in watching the coverage was even the Americans were jumping up and down and saying, look, Prince William is driving. He's gotten into the driving seat. Oh my God, there's not a chauffeur driving. Can you believe how real this young couple is? I mean, it was entertaining, but and then it's also wonderful to watch these anchors who have all flown over there. By the way, CBS rushed a hiring process to make sure that their news feed had a correspondent in London in time for this. And they told him, we're hiring you, we're sending you over next week, you're hired. There was none of the normal stuff. Everybody was there. This was a big story. They saw it coming, and they all wanted to be there.
I'll just quickly get the comment from Richard Fitzwilliams, and then we'll move to our guest in Moscow. Richard, in terms of how the media is actually covering, the royal birth, but the royal family in general, here we are. We're unlike 15, 20 years ago. We're in an age of social media. But I'm just wondering, it does feel like the royal family has managed to modernize and kind of embrace that new aspect of media, because here we have quite a young, perfectly normal couple. One's a commoner. Perhaps is this the modernizing of the royal family? And as a commentator, do you think that this is kind of, I wouldn't say it's choreographed, but it's kind of carefully looked at as how they are presented to the media?
I think that what has happened is what basically had to happen after the 1990s, because that was a period which really was a disaster for the royal family. I mean, practically every single thing that could go wrong actually went wrong. And there was no question at all that a major operation was required. Lessons were learnt after Diana's death. But also, in the 1990s, you had rival royal press offices briefing against each other. I mean, they really were the seeds of disaster. Now you've got well-orchestrated campaigns. Firstly, the social media, Twitter, Facebook, Flickr, the royal website, all of this. The fact that even if you wish to download the Queen's Christmas broadcast in any way you can, at any time, you can do it. All this sort of thing. I mean, the fact the royal wedding with various important announcements, they use Twitter. They are hands-on. And the other aspect, which you cannot fake, there's no question at all that William and Kate love each other, that the chemistry between them is marvellous. As has just been said, it is a good news story. They're the world's most glamorous royal couple, and there is something that's irresistible about that, and there is something that people want to know and want to see. And certainly if they were denied pictures and not given pictures of the young prince, or not given the opportunity to see certain visits to certain places, because remember, this is going to be a travelling baby, and I mean, I suspect the Antipodes, remember William when he was 9 months old, was taken somewhat controversially there by Charles and Diana, and I suspect we'll see the baby travelling rather soon. We'll have Prince and George, a very good name. I think we all thought that was the case. Another thing, the bookies, that aspect of it, again, another aspect of news. All of this has played, you could say, into the hands, in a sense, of those who want to promote the strength of the monarchy. But the facts of the matter are there's been one other very, very important change, and that is the role of the paparazzi, and the fear also of the press in Britain that there's going to be a form of regulation imposed by Royal Charter. I mean, precisely where we stand with that, I'm unsure at the moment. But there's no question at all, illicit photographs have got absolutely no place, and very few places, and we saw that in the last year with two particular sets of them. Very, very few places will include them, or newspapers will even consider doing so. I mean, you could say the paparazzi, to coin a phrase in Britain, a British political phrase, are lower than vermin.
Well, I'd just like to get the view from Moscow. Alexey Pankin is joining us. He's a media expert there. I mean, we're talking about I guess the brand of the royal family. I mean, how did it go down in Russia? There was congratulations from the Russian president, of course, after the birth. But in terms of the brand of the royal family and the royal couple, how did it go down there?
Families are selling well. It's like if you take Swedish family or the abdication of the Belgian king and the ascension of the new one to throne. All this got a lot of coverage, and basically people love royal families. They love fairy tales. Of course, they love British royal family more than other royal families. And here, this was a rather big story of the news. Of course, in the mainstream newspapers and mainstream television channel, there was no saturation coverage, of course. I am working at a big newsroom where you more or less see what people are doing during the day. So often you see that from time to time they would go to internet and sort of check for the developments on what's going on, whether the baby was delivered or still sort of in the pipelines, etc., etc. So I suppose that here there was some coverage, but it still was more for the internet. On the other hand, I'm running a regional press syndicate for RIA Novosti, which is a major news agency here. And that means that we're selecting a very limited number of national and international news and sort of feeding them to our subscribers in the regional media. And so from the start, we thought that would be interesting. And we were sending all these, features, news with richly illustrated to regional papers above all throughout the country. And then nobody was using them. And we stopped doing this. So it was certainly not big news for, let's say, people in the provinces, or whatever reason, interest they had that was saturated by probably national television. So that was certainly not a local news. So that's the story here.
Well,
on the other hand, today,
yes.
For instance, in the same very newsroom, I saw that everyone were, well, not everyone, but lots of people were glued to their monitors, searching for, on the internet, the videos from the train crash in Spain. And that generated, I would say, more interest than the royal baby from this particular environment that I'm working in. And then, of course, after watching all these uncensored horrors, everybody's saying, "Oh, what a horror! It is impossible to watch. We can't stand this." Terrible scenes of
certainly a more tragic covering of a tragic event by the Royal News channels. I'd just like to get Professor Amos Gelb quickly before we go to the news. I'm just wondering, I mean, you talked about the role and coverage of other big stories in recent years, but I mean, in your view, do you think editors and those who make the decisions editorially on a story like the Royal Baby are simply operating in fear that they may miss out, they may lose viewers and so on? And in your view, is this true journalism? In your view, is this true journalism?
Then you get a discussion of what is journalism today. Look, if you're an editor today, your guest there, the editor of the Metro. It's not as simple as the old sanctimony of "let me tell you what you need to know." You got to do the balance. What is it that your audience, certainly what is your audience wants? How are you going to get new stuff there? What is the audience going to demand? What are you going to have? Can you afford to miss it? Well, obviously you can't afford to miss a really big story. unless you're somebody like Al Jazeera English, who is determined that they are going to miss all the big stories and cover all the stories that nobody else is covering. But if you're running any newsroom, you cannot have the sanctimony anymore of I will tell you what you need to know. You have to bear your audience in mind. Even the most tried and true, most upright, traditional journalistic shop has to pay attention to this stuff.
Particularly as you know that there is a competition, and if you don't do this, then your competitors will do and get all the audience.
You speak to editors in newsrooms today, and again, I'll refer to your guest. You have an editor on your sitting next to you. I mean, ask how are those pressures of being there today?
Well, I think we've got a bit of background noise there, but we'll return to this topic, the topic of the royal baby. Very happy news for most people around the world. That's after a short news update. This is the Voice of Russia. This is our weekly link up with our bureaus in Washington, D.C., Moscow, and here in London. My name is Brandon Cole, and in the studio with me is Richard James, Deputy Head of Content at Metro newspaper. Richard, I'd like to get your view, actually. It was quite interesting. I mean, you talked about how your newspaper dealt with the story, and clearly it was a big story for your publication, which is the fourth biggest in the UK. It was quite interesting seeing some of the kind of slightly wryer ways of covering it. The Guardian had a special Republican button that they could click on, and it would get rid of all the royal news. And also Private Eye, they had a front cover this week saying "Woman gives birth." I mean, there is room for that kind of more dry, sort of less feverish coverage, and perhaps it gives people a bit of perspective.
Yeah, I was slightly disappointed with the public Private Eye cover in a way. It was almost too obvious, and the Guardian's button was a bit of a gimmick. But in a way, it was tipping a hat to the fact that they knew it was the most popular story, so they knew they had to cover it. This was kind of the way of getting around it, I guess. So there were obviously ways that you didn't have to play it completely straight, but the newspapers themselves obviously did, and the Daily Mail, 20 odd pages of it on the Wednesday. So yeah, you could do little gimmicky things such as Private Eye and the Guardian did, but I don't think really that's what actually people were interested in. I think people were genuinely interested in hearing the news. They were very interested, obviously, in the first picture. That was what everyone wanted to know. Then the name, and so you could play around with it. But I think at the end of the day, actually, people just wanted a bit of straight reporting, and I think maybe that's why the 24-hour rolling coverage got a bit annoying for some people, because actually they just wanted to know some news. They wanted to actually have some facts. They didn't want any kind of gimmicks. They didn't want to, go to whoever's corresponded in another hospital somewhere else in the country, speaking to another Kate who just happened to be in labour at the same time. People just wanted to know the straight facts.
It certainly sounded, well, I saw, poor old Kay Burley on Sky News. We mentioned her before. Also Simon McCoy, the BBC presenter there, he was referring to how he was having to say the same thing over and over again. I guess there was a degree of frustration there. But actually, just turning to our guest in Moscow, Alexey Pankin, who is a media expert. I mean, I suppose there was a lot of trivia involved in this particular story, wasn't there? And I mean, in your view as a media analyst, do you see that this is kind of a move towards giving people irrelevant news because in lieu of the bigger story, I suppose?
The royal coverage, it certainly stands apart, and I suppose that from this we can make really very little conclusions, because that's, I think, the order of things that royal families are covered extensively, at least in their home countries, and the spin-off goes to other nations. But of course, if we are to speak about the serious journalism, then I would say that I suppose that it is really very seriously flawed now in terms of shaping perceptions of truly on the major stories. For instance, speaking about Britain, I have here in front of me a recent publication by a US business analyst and media analyst Bill Dunkley, which is called Litvinenko Case, Massive Media Fraud Uncovered. And he proves that there's the whole coverage of this Litvinenko death is not based on everywhere in the United States, in Britain, and he gives headlines which is not based on any kind of factual basis. That's interesting. That's a big story, because the perception of Russia is shaped largely on this Lithuanian affair, and then it turns out when somebody seriously looks into fact, what are the official statements, what the press say, it turns out that the press is full of lies and distortions. This is really serious.
Okay, well, look, I'd like to get the view from the United States just on, I guess, what the point he's making there, Amos Gelb, is that the line between right and wrong and how the media cover stories is a fine one. And there was the example, for instance, of this month the cover of Rolling Stone magazine with Zhokhar Tsarnaev being portrayed as some kind of rock star or film star. I mean, what did you make of that particular case, and how does that hold up as an example of how the media can cover a story like that? How the media can cover a story like that?
Well, let me first of all address the Litvinenko story, which I understand, and this has a lot to do with the perception elsewhere and how it's read. To be honest, if you mention Litvinenko's name in America, virtually 99% of the people are going to go, who? When it happened, there was some stories, it wasn't big. The Russia's perception right now is being created by a single thing, and it's the handling of the Snowden case of the NSA leak. So, with all due respect to my colleague in Moscow, that is what's shaping any perception of Russia, not some analyst's review of whether the media got it right or wrong. The Rolling Stone case is a very different case. It's a very interesting case. I think it was a very bold play that backfired in the way that New Yorker covers have backfired when they did a case with Hillary and Barack Obama sleeping together, right? Who's going to answer the phone with the big joke during the election. And you had the similar thing with with Time Magazine, or rather Newsweek, Daily Beast, had provocative covers. It was an attempt to be provocative. It failed badly from a journalistic perspective, and newsstand sales of Rolling Stones have gone up significantly with that cover. So as a journalistic exercise, it failed. As a journalistic business exercise, early returns seem to suggest it might have succeeded in doing what it was meant to do, which is sell magazines.
Actually, well, this morning we spoke to the editor of GQ, and he had this to say about that Rolling Stone cover.
The covers are a different game now, much more market-driven. And as the recent Rolling Stone cover controversy with Zhokhar Tsarnaev has shown, people can take the slightest hint of controversy on the cover as well. So none of these great George Lewis covers would have made it in our time, because people forget that Time magazine had Hitler as the person of the year once, and Rolling Stone had put Charles Manson on the cover.
Alexey, Pankin in Moscow, that's the point. Charles Manson was put on the cover of Rolling Stone. Rolling Stone has a good reputation for good journalism, and in fact the article of Zhokhar Tsarnaev really examines what made him do what he did. So okay, it was you could argue that it was a gimmick, but journalistically it was quite sound, wasn't it? What do you think?
And I suppose that either you really sort of respect the sensitivities of your audiences, or you believe that putting this particular guy on the cover, you make a very important message, which is of great public interest. And if you feel that you are doing this in public interest, you should stand by your decision, definitely, whatever it costs you in market terms, in terms of sales, protests, etc. If you feel you're doing this consciously, then you should stand by that. I think so.
Well, I suppose, just in terms of, what do you think, Richard, James? Obviously, this is a kind of story that suggests that it was a commercial kind of story that gamble, and it was a commercial gamble, and it was a commercial gamble that worked because the bulk of their subscribers the bulk of their audience are actually subscribers, so that won't make any difference to sales. But it got Rolling Stone talked about. For a story like that, how important is it for publications to be talked about, Richard, James?
Well, very important, but as you say, unfortunately, the article itself was a very good piece of journalism. It's a shame that it's been overshadowed by the cover, which I think is one of these things that had it not been whipped up into a storm by the media itself, it probably wouldn't have upset that many people at all. So it was a gimmick. It has worked in terms of everyone's talking about it. I'm sure as sales have gone up. It didn't necessarily need to be a gimmick. I'm sure. Well, one hopes that the quality of the article would have spoken for itself. They could have used any picture of him. I actually personally didn't have a massive problem with the image. I think the wording on the cover itself kind of explained why they'd chosen such an image. How the suspect had gone from who he was to where he ended up and allegedly committed the crimes he did. So, in a way, it is becoming slightly more important to get a cover talked about. We go back to the Private Eyes cover, and putting something on that not necessarily wouldn't have got talked about normally, but they put a gimmick on there, suddenly people are talking about it. So it is, but I think that the strength of journalism still speaks for itself. I don't think the gimmicks are in any way interfering with the proper journalism.
And I suppose this, and just going back to the royal baby and the big story this week, we're talking about over-the-top coverage. You could argue it's over-the-top coverage, but Richard Fitzwilliams, do you think this will continue, and long may it continue, I suppose, as far as you're concerned?
You raised an important point there, because over-the-top coverage, if you like, when you've got individuals such as, again, Kay Burley one mentions, or Simon McCoy standing outside for hours and nothing much is happening. But remember, with the baby, we've got the official photographs to come, we've got the christening to come, we've got the baby's first steps to come.
So there's certainly there's plenty to look forward to, but sadly we've run out of time. That's for Richard Fitzwilliams. He's royal commentator and former editor of the International Who's Who. Also here in the studio, Richard James, deputy head of content at Metro newspaper, and in Washington, Professor Amos Gelb, director of videography and broadcast at Medill, Washington program, and Alexey Pankin in Moscow. Stay tuned. Curtain Up, our weekly cultural show, is on next with Alice Lanyard. And this week she talks to Venora Bennett, who's written a book, Midnight in St. Petersburg, about a woman who flees pogroms of southern Russia. That's up next.
This is the Voice of Russia.